Now, Britain's universal credit system is in chaos. Nearly half of claimants not required to work, over 500,000 foreigners on benefit. Meanwhile, as I said at the beginning, asylum seekers staying in taxpayer-funded hotels. We had a counsellor on earlier whose work as a counsellor has involved a lot of trying to highlight this issue. Labour blocking reforms, the Home Office refusing to act. My goodness, let's speak to the investigative journalist David Shipley on this, who's written a piece on this very point. David, good afternoon to you. It's only when you read it out like that, that's only part of a list, I mean, it could go on and on. You think, is this the 21st century? This might be something you would be thinking could have happened before we were civilised, or before we had computer systems, or forward-thinking people. We've gone backwards.
I think we have in lots of ways. I think the British state that we live in now is much less functional than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Lots of things just don't work. The benefit system is clearly just a disastrous machine for handing money to people and not helping people get back to work, not helping people improve their lives. And the fact that we're paying away a fortune to people who aren't even British nationals, is bizarre. And I think we have a system where we've become almost pathologically concerned with caring for strangers, and we've forgotten that we actually have to look after our own country and our own people first.
Indeed, and at what point did that become a terrible thing to say? Because that seems to be what happens. And we spoke to a counsellor earlier on, and interestingly, one of the areas that he'd been kind of focusing on, this councillor John Edwards, independent councillor from Bracknell, was the Afghan resettlement scheme. This was couple of weeks he'd been literally talking about it, and now this happened, which kind of rather sort of proved his point. And he was simply making the argument that he had no problem with helping people who desperately needed help, but the level of assistance that was being given to some of these guys that were staying in hotels were far exceeded anything that many of his own constituents get in terms of a lifestyle, in terms of a government or local government help. And his headline of all of that, his conclusion to all of that, was just simply, this is not fair. And that's it, isn't it? It's not fair.
It's not fair. Also, it's not sensible. I mean, I'd go further than him. I think I would say I do have a problem with this idea that our duty is to care for everyone across the world who needs our help. We are not. We're not an incredibly rich country that can afford that.
Sure.
And actually, there are so many issues we have domestically in terms of people struggling, house prices, like the economic growth is flatlining. The idea that our duty is to care for others, and that's what we have to focus on, is crazy, I think. And you see it in this stuff about the Afghan scandal. The state seems to have decided that actually it has a duty to care for all these people from Afghanistan, whether or not they really work for us or not, whatever kinds of people they might be, simply out of some sense of obligation. And actually, at the cost of that is a huge cost to British residents, British nationals.
100%. It's almost a go-to instinctive government response. It goes across the parties as well. Oh, yeah, we can do that. We'll help with that. It's like, there's quite a lot of implications in doing that. I mean, there's obviously economic implications, there's cultural, social cohesion implications as well.
Absolutely, and I think the cost that's been put on this Afghan scheme is £7 billion, and as I understand it, that's really just for relocating people here.
Yeah.
The lifetime cost, when the average Afghan family has 5 people in it, so these guys are coming over with 4 or 5 dependents, is going to be vast, particularly given the low typical rates of employment, the low levels of economic activity, and the high levels of criminality, particularly sexual violence we see in Afghan men who've come here. So there's a huge amount of harm that comes from this. But the attitude seems to be, it doesn't matter, the British people can suffer a bit, as long as we can feel like we're doing what we are doing good.
And it's interesting, because I mentioned this earlier, at what point, I mean, there's a sort of graph out at the moment, and it's authenticated, that shows that, by nationality, sex offenders by nationality, and Afghan men are at the top of the list, way disproportionate to other nationalities. Now, there could be lots of reasons for that, but just park those for 1 second. The fact is, they are at the top of the list. I mean, however, or what's in somebody that makes them more likely to commit a crime. You could talk about cultural issues, which I'm sure are probably the biggest component in the pie chart on this. perhaps, simply that by dint of a lack of education, all of these issues, whatever they happen to be, doesn't really matter in some respects. If they're at the top of the list, then that deserves some scrutiny, right? I mean, somebody should say, hang on, you're bringing in thousands of people from Afghanistan, while simultaneously we can see this is the particular group that are more likely to commit sexual offences against women in this country than any other group. At what point does a government not think it's their responsibility to join the dots on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it doesn't really matter why, whether it's some innate quality or it's just the function of men having grown up in a society where women are treated appallingly. The reality is, we know that by bringing in thousands and thousands of young Afghan men, we are creating more instances of sexual assault and rape in this country. And I think it's clear by the way it behaves that the British state prefers to care for foreign men as opposed to caring for British women, and that is appalling.
I mean, it really is. And when the council that we spoke to earlier sort of listed what happens if you get put into, and these were sort of smaller groups than some of the Channel migrants that were coming over. So they were sitting in 4-star hotels, and they were obviously getting nicely looked after. It was warm, it was comfortable. There were 3 meals a day. There was no mould on the ceiling. There was no windows that were leaky in the winter. They were able to get, it's not private healthcare, but it's within the NHS, but sits outside the NHS system, where a medical team will come to you if you need some kind of assistance. It's way more than the average person. I mean, that's just not okay.
It's not, and I think there's this across the British state. We see it with all these stories. This almost pathological preference for the outsider. There's a story I had out in the Times today where I looked at this as well. So obviously there's been a lot of news about Deliveroo and other delivery companies apparently having illegal workers working for them. And it turned out that Deliveroo had actually turned around to the Home Office and said, look, if you give us the locations of asylum seeker hotels, we'll be able to identify accounts that are operating from those locations and block them. Simple technical solution to stop this illegal working. And the Home Office said, no, we couldn't possibly do that because it might put the asylum seekers at risk. It might be a safety risk for them.
Right.
And there's this, again and again, you see this approach where the most important thing is caring for people from somewhere else. And the first duty of a state should be to care for its own citizens and its own people.
You would think so.
Well, it should be. The British state is failing at that very clearly.
And in so many areas that we discuss. I mean, this has tentacles in all sorts of aspects of our life. And we mentioned at the beginning there about universal credit. And, it's failing its own people on this one as well. 3.6 million people are exempt from work. Now, I'm not a clinician. I can't, conjure up the specific numbers. And if somebody, doesn't have any legs or they've got a horrendous mental health issue, I'm the first to say that's exactly where I want my tax money to go. I'm fine with that. I just do struggle that there's 3.6 million people who are exempt from going to work. They're not forced to look for work in any shape or form. And whilst understanding that some people will be in that position, 3.6 million.
Yeah, it's very high.
Massive.
And I think if you look at the numbers since COVID, the rates of disability have shot up. And it looks a bit in some ways like the 80s, where under Thatcher, the government essentially tried to hide how bad unemployment was by moving a lot of people onto sickness benefit. And I think there's lots of efforts here to sort of hide how bad our economy is, and in some ways it's maybe easier for the government to say these people are unwell than to try to do something about it. And no one thinks that people who are genuinely disabled should be made to work. But actually, a lot of people probably would benefit from having something purposeful to do in their lives.
You think so?
Yeah, it's almost like putting people in prison where they have nothing to do. Leaving people at home all day with no purpose and no work can actually be really negative for them.
Yeah. I wonder if it is that. Is it the fact that it's easier for governments to do? It's often said the only thing worse than some idle character with a gyro in his hand is an idle character without a gyro in his hand. That's a greater headache for the state. So pay some money because it makes something go away. And I is the kind of path of least resistance for the state in many respects.
Yeah, I think so. It's like the Afghan thing where rather than thinking about the problem and trying to solve it a different way, the state just threw £7 billion at bringing tens of thousands of Afghans over here. And there does seem to be a kind of laziness in the way the civil service and the state generally makes decisions.
And you wonder about the calibre of politicians sometimes, don't you, when you look at, and I know depending on where people sit politically depends on what they sort of project onto their kind of heroes or villains in Westminster. But when you look across it, and I look at the front bench, it concerns me there's very little, if not any, business experience in the cabinet. I find that almost criminal that would be the case. But I can't see experience in many other places either, for that matter. Yeah. So, and that to me is a problem. And I look across, and also in both parties, both main parties, and you think, where these are literally, these people are making multi-billion-pound decisions, and they are hopeless. And that's not just a cheap point. I think our proportion of hopeless MPs is probably at an all-time high.
I think so as well. And I think it was very obvious today at Prime Minister's questions. No one brought up the issue of the Afghan cover-up.
Yeah.
No one. You know, there were sort of questions about all sorts of other things, but no one actually addressed the most significant issue facing the country in the news today. And I think that speaks to a real lack of quality and lack of seriousness in our Parliament.
What do we need? Do we need some kind of, I don't know, revolution? I don't mean people taking to the streets. I mean a revolution within, you know, how we do politics, our system, the checks and balances, the just heady levels of ineptitude that snake their way around all departments, local government as well as national government.
Yeah, I think in light of the Afghan scandal, where let's remember what the British state has done is decide to embrace a policy which is going to bring over 100,000 Afghans here, and it decided to lie about it. It hid the fact that it spent the money, it hid that money from the public accounts, it hid that money from the bond markets, it then also hid those numbers from the immigration figures. There was a huge concerted attempt to deceive Parliament, the British people, the media about this policy. It was done completely undemocratically. And I think it's very hard to see that a state which behaves in that way has any kind of democratic legitimacy. And I do believe what we need to do is establish a new way of running this country. I think it has to come through a democratic revolution. I think we need to look at the civil service itself, which is the consistent bit that runs between the governments. You know, the Afghan scandal happened under the Tories and Labour, but the civil servants are the same, and I think the civil service is hugely to blame. You know, we need a new settlement, I think, and a new way of running things in this country, which actually serves the needs of the people, not the desires of politicians and civil servants to, you know, feel good about themselves.
I think there's that phrase groupthink just seems to spring up time and time again, certainly in my mind, in all sorts of areas, in global initiatives and but domestic ones. Well, this is how we've always done it, and because there's a lot of people in government that aren't very intelligent, and I don't mean they haven't got a degree, I mean just genuinely not really intelligent, nuts and bolts intelligent. Things don't get challenged. They wouldn't know how to challenge it. The civil service want an easy life. They like the status quo. They, you know, they've got their nice pensions and they, you know, hang around doing what they have to do. And this pervasive groupthink way of functioning just seems to be there all the time. Every story that I look at some point, I open a door, a metaphoric door, and I see the words groupthink in neon lights. And that's how it rolls. Oh, this is how we do it. This is how we've always done it. There's no real challenge, no desire, no thirst to change the system and you know, somehow attempt to improve the very things that we talk about on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the British state, there's almost no part of it which works now. And I think a huge reason for that is the groupthink in the civil service. Part of the reason, I think, is general intelligence, but also bureaucracies don't tend to reward people who are independent thinkers.
Yeah.
Bureaucracies like people who just go along and run the process. So I think as we redesign the British state for the future, we need to find a way to create a system which rewards independent thinking, which rewards success and actually punishes failure. And that's the other big effect. There's no, you know, apparently no one's even been sacked or disciplined for emailing out these records to a bunch of people
moved to
in
another
Afghanistan.
department, apparently.
Yes, and that's so common. If you look at anything in the civil service, people who fail are moved sideways, moved upwards sometimes. There is no real consequence for failure. And so, of course, these departments become full of, you know, people who are bad at their jobs if you never get removed.
You have to, so somebody said you have to almost commit second-degree murder to lose your job in the civil service. And I've heard some just unbelievable tales of people who've been very naughty at work. When I say naughty, I mean whether it's alcohol-related or whatever, essentially just not doing their job. And they've gone through every process that in the commercial world you'd just be told, thank you, mate, your time's up. But over there, at the civil service, it's like, no, well, we'll just find another job for Bert. Unfortunately, he was caught doing, that in the library. So, but don't worry, because Bert's, he's got a drink problem. He's got a drink problem. This is a very real story, by the way. So we'll move him somewhere else. So Bert gets moved somewhere else, and he just drank somewhere else and did whatever else he was doing somewhere else and looking at stuff he shouldn't be looking at. And they couldn't fire this guy. And it's like, well, what point can you not? Well, he's got a mental health issue. Well, no, he hasn't got a mental health issue. He just likes, for some reason, drinking a lot and self-abuse in public corridors.
Yeah.
I mean, it's things like that.
It is, and I think anyone who does any kind of investigating into the civil service, you encounter these stories where people have done things like that, even acts of apparent corruption, and they just stay in the organisation. And it's the result after decades of that is you just get departments staffed with people who are not good at their jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And then somebody rises to the top, don't they? And then the problem's then compounded, because somebody who wasn't very good in the first place becomes the boss of that department, or the line manager, and that sort of Peter Principle thing kicks in, and you have very sort of inadequate, very mediocrity reigns supreme over there at the civil service, but it suits everyone, so nobody does anything about it.
I think so, and of course, if people have risen up despite their failures, they have a strong incentive to keep those failures quiet.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that culture of covering up,
you
see it. An extreme example is Afghanistan thing, but lots of failures in the civil service are covered up all the time, and often as a journalist, when I go to challenge press desks about this stuff, they're most interested in who's leaked it, who's provided the information, rather than recognising that they're at fault and there's something they need to do to improve things.
Because there's so many people with, it seems, there's sort of this thread of inadequacy that threads itself through the system. I suppose nobody blows the whistle, really, on the inadequacy, because they've got their own inadequacies. So it's a sort of almost a kind of, it's kind of a satirical sketch from the 60s that you can imagine David Frost writing, back in the day. It's got that all over it, isn't it? Oh, I don't report on him because he might report on me. It's got that all over it.
Oh, gosh, absolutely. And you see it as well often with outsourcing, that people who've worked in the government department then go to run the outsourced entity, and they're supervised by the guy who used to work for them within the civil service, and everyone knows each other. These relationships are impossibly cosy and often, functionally, if not literally, corrupt. The whole system is just failed. And I think in terms of politics, hopefully, now we're all starting to realise how bad it is. I believe and hope that actually good people will realise they have to get involved in politics, because otherwise we're not going to fix this.
A little bit of breaking news just come in. We understand so far at least 3 MPs have lost the whip. This is the Labour whip, with others reported to be meeting with party whips at the moment. The 3 suspended MPs are understood to be Brian Leishman, Scottish politician, Alloa and Grangemouth, Chris Hinchcliffe and Neil Duncan Jordan, which sounds like a Tory MP tribute act, doesn't it? Neil Duncan Jordan, who's a Labour MP. So, they've apparently been seen not to have adhered to party regulations.
Do we know what for? Or
I think it's connected to the Jeremy Corbyn Sultana kind of.
Oh, this is the thing.
But we don't fully know what the details are.
We know that Corbyn, of course, was furious that Sultana went too early with the announcement, don't we?
That's right. Yes, I mean that shows that's proper kind of Animal Farm territory, isn't it? We're all in it together. It's like no, I'm more powerful than you.
I'm the bigger comrade, not you.
Absolutely.
That sort of stuff,
Yeah, all of that. It's how it always ends in that kind of that sort of thinking. Listen, David, great to have you on with us again. Good to see you, David Shipley, the investigative journalist, with us on the programme.